arraignment. Your counsel is requesting that your arraignment be continued to January 7, 2026. Do you waive your right to a speedy arraignment so that your arraignment can be heard on January 7, 2026? And does counsel join in the waiver?
I join, Your Honor.
The court finds that the defendant has made a knowing and intelligent waiver of his right to a speedy arraignment, and that his counsel joins in that waiver.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
9 years ago, Nick's parents gave him an ultimatum. If you want to do things your way, get out. And guess what? Nick left home, preferring to be a homeless drug addict than sober and with a home and a family. And hasn't he just made that same choice again? According to Rolling Stone, if I wanted to do it my way and not go to the programs they were suggesting, then I had to be homeless. That's what Nick told people in 2016. He added, I was homeless in Maine. I was homeless in New Jersey. I was homeless in Texas. I spent nights on the street. I spent weeks on the street. It was not fun. And on Saturday night and on Sunday, he was homeless essentially again, also spending nights on the street.
And we want to take a closer look at that surveillance video Alex mentioned. Just after 9 Sunday night, Nick Reiner walked into the AM/PM gas station on Vermont and Exposition Boulevard. He briefly wandered around the store before buying a drink and then walking out.
9 years later, Nick appears to have made the same choice because at the moment, he's homeless again.
Police say this was just hours after he had killed his parents.
I was actually walking in, so he was walking out, like when he passed by, I guess. I didn't know who he was. I just thought he was just like a regular customer.
And I mean, in a real sense, that's what he was. He was just a regular customer.
After leaving the store, Nick walked across the street where he was stopped and arrested by police.
According to page 6, one of Nick's former co-workers provided screen grabs of his Instagram profile and also spoke to them about their working together on the set of Family Guy in 2014. That's 11 years ago. He was an intern on the show Family Guy for around 3 to 6 months. It's not even a very long time. His father helped him get the gig, and Rob would drop him off and pick him up every day. He was coming off rehab then, so he was sober. This was part of his path to recovery. His whole identity was being sober. And we're going to have a look at these Instagram photos and his Instagram profile and what this insider, what this friend says about him. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the many of you who have subscribed. If you're finding this analysis worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button and do stay till the end of this video where I'll share some of my own thoughts about what drug addicts are trying to do, their psychology, and the whole mental health aspect. All right, so let's get started.
And so we begin right now at 4 with some new details from the medical examiner about how Rob and Michelle Reiner died. That preliminary report reveals both Rob and Michelle died from multiple sharp force injuries. It comes just hours after their son Nick made his first court appearance charged in their murders.
So when Nick was about 21 years old, his whole identity, his whole persona was about him not taking drugs. One can imagine coming from a wealthy family. I mean, right now there's a $200 million inheritance on the line. Nick probably assumed he didn't want for anything and didn't need to work. And of course, when these murders happened, he was unemployed. For years prior, wasn't he unemployed as well? His job was basically feeling good about himself, even though he was a nobody. In other words, his whole identity was of a poor little rich boy. According to page 6, a source told us that Nick would work 4 hours a day, but would spend most of his time shooting the shit with his fellow employees. He did not work hard, and he wasn't a hard worker, the insider alleged. He was 100% entitled. There was really no responsibility for him because we didn't have interns. It was a favor for Rob. Now, one thing I would really like to know is, has Nick ever worked a proper job in his life? I don't feel like Nick had any responsibility 9 years later either. And as a 32-year-old, it looks like his identity about being sober had not only worn thin, but had been worn out. And that is, as I see it, the problem in this particular case, you're dealing with someone who has no identity, and he's within the situation of people with extremely strong identities. And so this whole thing about his whole identity was being sober, that was his identity when he was supposed to have an identity. That, you know, that is the time when a lot of people, young people, find out who they are. His whole identity is just being sober. That's not an identity. In hindsight, doesn't that seem pretty weak, and also ultimately a false persona, because it was a persona he couldn't maintain? I think the reality was that he simply didn't have a persona or personality. He just became a shallow, superficial person who wanted stuff, wanted his own way, and didn't have whatever it is, the right stuff, to stand on his own and to stand apart as a real person in the real world. And you might say he felt that he was in the shadow of these giants and he couldn't move out of that shadow, but it's quite easy to create an identity. Just follow your talents and find something that you're interested in. The trouble is, if you're entitled, you're always going to gravitate to those entitlements. Back to page 6. His darkness was his humor. He has a dark sense of humor, the source explained. He was a funny kid. He was charismatic in a dark, introverted way. He was a goofy 20-year-old. The insider told page 6 that Nix would often say fucked up things, dark things, with a tinge of humor. He was the black sheep. He felt like a fuck up. He knew that, the source continued. He was self-aware of how his family was doing and how he represented them in a negative space, but none of that felt offensive or scary. Well, not so much at Conan's party. He wasn't self-aware there, and people were offended by Nick, and his father was scared enough to take him along because his father felt he needed to keep tabs on Nick. Now, if we take this talk about saying fucked up things, a dark sense of humor and being goofy, anyone remember this was also how people described Amanda Knox and how Amanda Knox described herself? There's a point where Knox was, I think, at the Questura, and some of Meredith's British friends said, I hope that she didn't suffer. And Knox said, of course she suffered. She fucking bled to death. You know, that is a fucked up thing to say. And then there were also goofy things associated with Amanda Knox. And another fucked up thing was basically implicating her boss. Knox also refers to herself as goofy at least 3 times in her own book. Me, serious, goofy, early bird. I was being goofy. I spoke my own goofy language. Also this from the New York Times. Friend described her as naive, goofy, unconventional, harmless, sheltered, etc. Meredith Kircher, whom Knox lived with, remember, she ended up knifed to death in her bedroom with extremely vicious injuries to both sides of her throat. Anyway, let's go back to Nick Reiner. On Nick's Facebook page is a photo from his time working on Family Guy. He could be seen sitting under a desk as he captioned the snap, having fun at work. And that seems to be Nick's mission in life, to have fun. Despite liking Nick, the source explained how he wasn't surprised when he heard that Nick had been arrested on charges of murder. I'm not that shocked. He is a troubled person. Nick had an era, I think that should be aura, of darkness around him with his addiction issues. When you have addiction and mental health, there is room for emotional murders. I don't really like this association of addiction and mental health. I don't think Nick was an addict because of his mental health. I think his addiction, when he was of sound mind, when he made that choice over and over again, then later on it started to impact his mental health. But I do think this assumption could be heavily relied on by his defense lawyer because it's such a popular misconception that Nick isn't responsible for his actions, his mental health is, which also has nothing to do with him. People don't seem to realize that certain drugs permanently destroy the brain and can alter the personality, not suddenly or instantaneously, but over time and systematically. Meth use, for example, can lead to psychosis, including schizophrenia, hearing voices, and becoming unable not just to work, but to do anything. Look at this from Frontiers. Chronic meth abuse commonly leads to psychosis. And then from UNSW Sydney, meth psychosis is characterized by paranoia and hallucinations, that feeling of being overly suspicious of other people. It doesn't seem unfounded. He was a troubled kid from a young age and had issues. but that's not the Nick I knew.
Things up? What did you think was gonna happen?
What I find insane with drug addicts is that they seem to think they can get the good without the bad, that they can have these insane highs at no cost and with no consequences. You know, that they can breathe through life without being accountable to anything. They believe this because the point of taking drugs is not to be in the real world. But of course, the drugs always wear off, and that's what you're left with, reality. And the unspoken promise of drugs and drug addiction is that the reality you leave when you start is 1,000 times better than the reality you enter when you're done and dusted. So the whole premise of drug addiction is a lie. It doesn't deliver you from evil. It delivers you unto evil, naked, with no friends or family at the end of that road, no money and no hope. All there is you cowering in the face of life, cowering in the face of death, cowering and a coward, which is what we see in the CCTV and the eventual arrest of Nick Reiner. There's nothing cool or edgy about this.
Tonight, new video capturing the moment Nick Reiner was taken into custody. The murder suspect seen raising his hands as LAPD moved in, cuffing him less than 6 hours after police discovered the bodies of his father Rob and mother Michelle.
I do think if Nick murdered his parents, there's a symbolic aspect to it as well. He wanted to transcend being a child and being told what to do by his parents. Everyone does. Everyone should. That's a normal and rational response to growing up. Most people reach this point as teenagers at around 18, but most people individuate without killing their parents. Nick was still trying to reach that level, moving beyond his parents at 32 years old. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.